All right, guys, so I did a little bit more work on these with the pin, just that same small pin. But we have a couple different versions of quality of line. So you've got the smoother, the rougher, the more natural kind of leafy feel, a little jagged. So each section, smooth, kind of jagged, even more, each area has its own quality to the line. But what there's not a lot of is a variety within thin and thick, or light and dark lines. So that's what we're going to talk about next is more variety of lines. So with the different sizes of pencils, or pens, sorry, in this case, but pencils, this is true, the darkness of your pencil, you can do this with pens, you can do this with anything really, charcoal. So you can start to get a variety of really thin, slightly bolder and thicker, and you can kind of scale up the size of your pen. So I have a set of 4 where we go from thin to thicker, kind of like nibs on the pen. I also, if you notice, if you want to bold up your line a little bit, I kind of have to go back over it a couple times, back and forth. And at the very end, if you have anything like this, this is like a brush pen here. So it's got a brush tip, which by gently pressing on it, I can get a fatter line. So sometimes like Sharpie makes one of these. Again, these are the pit pins. And I can also go, by changing the pressure, I can go wide like a calligraphy pen and then ease up and get a nice thin point. But this is what I'm talking about with variety of really, really thin, subtle, medium, all the way up to really bold and thick. And most line drawings are gonna become more dynamic and interesting the more of that variety that you start to show. Whereas these feel a little more flat and every line is about the same right now. Okay, so let's test this line variety idea out on one of the objects, and I'm gonna pick this leaf to work on. So something important to remember is that brush pen is awesome, but it's also dangerous because once you go really dark, it's hard to go back from a really dark, bold mark. So I'm gonna save that one for a while, but I do wanna lock in some of my bolder lines just to start getting some variety. So one that I see a shadow on the underside of my stem through the leaf. So I am gonna come in with a slightly thicker pen, and I'm just going to bold up that underside line. Not both lines, there's kind of still a thin line on top, but I'm gonna make the base or lower side of the stem a little bit of a thicker line. Let's see what that does. Okay, right away, that stands out as a little more pronounced than other parts of the leaf. Okay, let's do a similar type of a thing with the edges. So one thing I'm going to look at is what parts of the edges seem to stand out as bolder than others. And for the most part, this doesn't have a ton of light and shadow in this particular drawing, but I do see in my photo kind of under this portion of the leaf, a few spots over here, kind of a drop shadow underneath. So I'm going to pick a few areas to emphasize because it almost seems like there's more light and dark in certain areas. So not everywhere evenly. I'm gonna go more pressure sometimes, like right in here at the tip of this tooth, if you wanna call it that, or point. I'm putting more pressure and now I'm easing up and going a little bit lighter. And then I'm just gonna let that kind of fade back into the original light lines that we chose. But already our eye kind of starts to come down to this area, and I could really bump that up even darker. Oh. And it's gonna have even more of that feeling where it starts to steal the show a little bit and stands out even more so. Okay, so if you notice already my eyes now kind of bounce from this darker line to down here. Now, what you don't want to do is make it stick out like a sore thumb like it does right now. So I'm gonna try to make this feel like it just kind of fades and blends and fits in and feels like it belongs a little bit. So already just that little bit, I'm kind of fading it out into the rest of the leaf. Now, maybe for a while I let it stay really light, and now I'm gonna pop back a little bit of darkness as I work my way up. So especially in this area, because I see a little bit of shadow in my image over here too. Okay, so once again, super important. I'm trying not to darken everything evenly so as to give it a little bit of a changing feel as I go around the leaf. So we go from thin to medium to much thicker in some spots. And the same could be true for something like our stem. So I'm going to test out the brush pen now, but you have to be, again, super careful with this because it's really easy to go way too dark. But as I work my way down the stem, I just want to make that feel like it really boldens, I don't think that's a word, but gets bolder as I work all the way down the stem, and then it's just going to fade back to a little bit of a smaller line. So again, if you look at this compared to say this, it's starting to stand out on that page, right? And pop out just a little bit more. So let's look at what we might do to the top edge to get that same sort of a feeling. Again, I'm going to try to find certain points to emphasize. Then I'm just going to let that line fade back to my light line work. And then where else do I see some emphasis? I feel like I see a little bit of a bolder edge in a few other places up here. And again, one of the most important things is that as I go from really, really thick back to thin again, because you don't want all the lines to be the same. That would defeat the purpose of what we're doing. As I go back into the thinner lines, we want it to be a smooth transition to where it just goes seamlessly from really thicker lines, medium, back to thin. That's what's going to make it look like it's well blended. So what I mean by that is it would be really easy to go to have a nice kind of medium or thin line like that, and you could go and go from thick to thin, and it feels like it's too aggressive, right? It kind of like it's jarring. It's kind of nice to be able to go from thick seamlessly into thin, almost like it's just a slow fade. And that's a nice thing to test for yourself. So that means also you can see I could go really wide with this pen if I wanted to. You can push this idea as far as you want to, or not as far. So the further you go with this, the more I think it starts to feel a little bit like illustration or design a little bit, which isn't a bad thing at all. Also, the further you go with it, the more certain elements could start to pop out for you, and you get more of that variety. So it's really fun to see how wide and bold, how thin and skinny, and can I connect the dots and make it all work together in one flowing image. So one last thing I'm going to look into would be things like the veins on the leaf. So just by easing up the pressure, I can start a little thicker and then work my way thinner. Now this is a little dangerous. I'm using that brush pen. Be careful because it's really hard to control those thin lines with the brush pen. So what might be a smarter move, and I'll show you this in a second, would be to work your way with a kind of more of a medium pen tip. This would be like it's kind of starting your pencil drawing with a really dark pencil. We rarely do that, so just keep that in mind. But what's kind of a nice feel, and now I'm barely tapping the pen to the paper to get these really thin lines. I switched to my much thinner pen here. But what I think is a good look on these kind of veins within the leaf is where we go from that thicker, medium, all the way out to the thin, and kind of have a nice range of everything in between. You've got the thinnest, delicate lines, really bold and aggressive, and you get this good range in between. So if we zoom out a little bit, let me zoom, perfect. Hopefully what you notice right away is that as far as things popping off the page, if we don't consider all this Sharpie work that I did, now this isn't finished, we could do this forever and ever, but this guy really catches our eye, right? If you were looking at this up on a gallery wall, museum wall, this is gonna pop right out, where these are still a little bit on the light and kind of undercooked or unfinished side. So keep that in mind. And then one last thing, just because I'm telling you guys to go kind of bold with the lines, it doesn't mean you want everything to be perfectly equal. And I've said it before, but just to demonstrate, if I go with my fattest brush pen and I just make every line exactly the same, it feels exactly like it did before, only bigger, right? So again, a good way to think of this is as things recede in space, as they go away from you, maybe the lines also start to fade. So we go from thick to medium, all the way back to thin. And now check out how what at first felt like everything was the same. I call them like coloring book lines. Everything's almost exactly the same thickness. Starts to get a little boring. Now you go from really, really thick in the front, the foreground, middle ground, all the way back to the background, right? So as those things are getting closer and closer to you, we're getting kind of more aggressive, thicker lines. And that can really help you with things like deep space and feeling like you've got a foreground, a middle ground, and then eventually a background way back there. So definitely things to think about when you're doing outlining. And again, this works for pens, but same sort of thing with pencils. So this is just an HB pencil, but we could go from really, really thick and bold into more of a middle tone, all the way to those faint, delicate lines. And that goes for charcoal, anything else.